Awesome. It's been a few minutes, so we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for everyone's patience this morning. Good morning, Mado. Um, uh, Thank you for everyone joining this morning's USET's Office of Economic Development Tribal Enterprise Virtual Workshop on the uh, Tribal Enterprises, the Engine of Growth for Native Communities. We just have some quick housekeeping notes for this morning. We encourage everyone to keep their cameras on as much as possible while you're participating, but we also ask everyone to please keep your mic muted so we can keep to the minimum background noises. Um, the scheduled presentation by Red Wind Group this morning does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by USET. Red Wind Group is a partnering friends with USET Office of Economic Development. So all the information provided today is for information purposes only. Finally, we are very honored to work with our partners for this event and others, and we would like to make this session and future sessions beneficial and helpful to you and your team. So with that, in the chat box, we'll be adding a link to an event survey, and we kindly ask you to click and participate and fill as much as you feel comfortable sharing. The responses of these surveys will help us identify future topics and make these future virtual workshops more efficient and effective. And pardon me, the session this morning is being recorded and will be available after the event. Each of y'all will receive an email at the end of today's session that will include not only the presentation slides, but then also a link to the video recording that will also be available on our USET YouTube page. So if you need to jump off early, or if you have team members that wanted to join but aren't able to attend this morning, feel free to share those links and share all this great, wonderful information with those within your community. Making sure, check something else. So and just quickly on the screen, just wanted to share a bit of the agenda for this morning. We'll be going into some introductions, and then we will, ahead of time, we'll be giving the floor to Kyle. And then one of the aspects that we're really excited about this event, and in case you weren't aware, USET has 3 core competencies in technical assistance. And one of those offices that we have is USET's Tribal Health Program Support, THPS. They host the annual USET Best Practices Conference. And in the previous years, it's been focused around public health best practices. But what sets that event in a particular unique setting is it incorporates best practices, tribal nations learning from tribal nations. And so one of the ways we wanted to incorporate that in today's session is right before we conclude, before the question and answer time, we'll be having a presentation from a USET member tribal nation, the Creek Indian Enterprise Authority from the Porch Band Creek Indians, to talk about their tribal enterprises and their history and how they set up their business activities. So we really wanted to give a bookend to the presentation this morning. And then what we've been, I hope to go into more detail at the concluding of our morning's event, but we also have some upcoming events hosted by USET. I hope everyone receives the USET programmatic alerts that are weekly, that are sent every Wednesday. And there are links and more information about these events if you would like to learn more. But with that, we'll go ahead and get started with today's agenda. Good morning again, and thank you for joining the Tribal Enterprise Workshop. Tribal engines are the engine of growth for many Native communities, with the understanding that tribal enterprises and Native American businesses face a unique set of challenges and can own a different set of advantages. Today's session will introduce you to the topics that show how tribal businesses can succeed and bring economic benefits to communities. Created in 2016 through the adoption of the USET Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy, or SEDS, the USET Office of Economic Development assists member tribal nations with the growth of economic and community development efforts. USET staff supports the work of healthy and vibrant tribal economies through training and technical assistance, like this morning's session, resource brokering, and research and data. One item produced by the Office of Economic Development is the USET Tribal Enterprise Directory. The USET Tribal Enterprise Directory introduces economic development activities that are currently being offered and managed by USET member tribal nations, and to offer contact information for these initiatives to promote nation-to-nation trade and/or economic partnerships to facilitate the development of strong tribal economies. With more than 600 tribal nation enterprises, businesses, and economic development opportunities listed, this directory introduces business opportunities and activities throughout the USET membership. The purpose of the directory is to, one, inform USET membership what economic development activities are currently being offered, and two, offer contact information for these activities to promote nation-to-nation trade. The most up-to-date directory is linked in the chat box and through the USET website, and a printable version of the 2022 directory is available for download. Please notify myself, Rebecca Narragon, USET's Office Economic Development Director, of any edits or changes that should be made. So that was just a little introduction to set up our office and to introduce today's session. We'll head straight into our first presenter for the day, and that is Mr. Kyle Smith with the Red Wind Group. Red Wind is an American Indian management consulting firm that specializes in the design and development of high-performance organizations. With more than 25 years of experience in economic business development, Red Wind has worked in a number of industries, including tribal government, communications, energy, electronics, financial services, and transportation. So with that, I will pass the presentation baton on to you, Kyle, and we'll make sure in the chat box, we're going to add Kyle's contact information. So you'll have that information available, as long with a copy of his PowerPoint presentation so you can follow along. And Kyle, just let me know for the polls questions that we have, just let me know when you would like those to be deployed.
Okay, sounds good. So good morning, everybody. So maybe as a quick word, I don't know, Rebecca, if this is okay. So we got Chuck. I was just going to say hello to each of you guys. So maybe just do a quick, let's do that first poll real quick. See how many people are at their desk and are ready to go. So let's do this first question poll, Rebecca. It's in what stage of development is your tribal business? So for you guys, if you would just click on that and let's just see what you've got. Or if you're pre-venture, you're thinking about some stuff, your startup, early stage, hey, you're going great guns, you're mature, or you're on the decline. Now, for some of you guys, you may have multiple ventures out there, so you may be in startup in a few. Pick the one where you've got the greatest amount of sort of resources or revenue going into. Okay. So pretty much a couple startup questions. So startup and some strong growth here. Okay,
I
good.
currently have four answers.
Right, so 4 out of 5 of the folks we've got online. So we're pretty much heavily in the front end startup. Okay, so that's good. So as we go through just the time we have, feel free to ask some questions as we go through, particularly on startups, pre-ventures here. Okay, okay, great. You want to share that? Does everybody see that on the screen? Okay, great. Let's just look at let me just introduce myself again, and I'm going to close this out and share the results here. So just a little bit of background, as Rebecca introduced us. We've been teaching for the last 4 or 5 years a class on tribal enterprises, how to start them, how to grow them. We've probably done about 15 to probably 20, 25 classes, 50 so tribes have been involved. So we've learned a lot from our tribal participants, and we're funded by the SBA to do this. So what I'll do, Rebecca, if we wanted to, is to start through. I can walk through. Let me go ahead and I'll walk through a couple of a little bit through the presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up the sort of the PowerPoint. Okay, and feel free to ask a question if you want to unmute or use the chat line. Okay. Okay, so Chuck, I'm going to look over to you real quick since you've got the tractor in the back. It caught my eye. Just let me know if we can see, if you guys can see okay here. Okay, good. So let me walk through a couple of slides, and I'll slow down to a couple of factors here, and feel free to ask questions if you're in the pre-venture or startup kind of phase, and then feel free to ask as we go through. Okay. So so what Rebecca was saying, what we see in a lot of Native communities, that the tribal enterprises, whether they're casinos or the quick trips, the small businesses, they can become the engine of growth. If you go up north and you see the Alaska Native Corps, they're pulling in, you know, anywhere from 500 million to $1 million with maybe an 8 to 10% return to their village communities. If you go to the lower 48, you'll find out there's a number of course casino enterprises doing great guns, returning dividends back. But for the sake of discussion today, we'll talk less about the casinos and more about the independent businesses that may do work, say, with the federal government. Now, one of the things I just want to introduce is the fact that as we've learned, is not all tribal communities are the same. And so not all Native American businesses are the same. They have a different set of challenges and a different set of advantages. And as we go through this, we really want to talk about where are those unique challenges and what's the unique advantages you take, you know, just to take advantage of. Like, for instance, let's just say, if we look at the Oklahoma-Texas border, there's 2 or 3 casinos right up on the border, and they've got access to all that traffic. So the Chickasaws and Choctaws are just growing great guns with their casinos. And then those casinos are funding, community services and funding diversification in businesses. So one of the things we'll talk about on these 6 factors later on is where's our advantages. So let me walk through a couple of these 6 success factors that we've identified. And maybe, Rebecca, can you do this? Can you pull up the poll that asks the question about where we see the barriers for Native American businesses, and particularly the tribal business? So if you don't mind, take a look at that and see which one of those do you think is the biggest barrier for success in your own community. And I'll read through them out loud. So lack of community and support and trust. So there's a distrust going on, and so we never get going. Some political infighting, either between the businesses or the tribal folks or the leadership. Third is, hey, we have these advantages and we're not leveraging them. You know, we've got these 8A advantages, we've got our sovereignty advantages, we've got our locational advantages. Are we leveraging those? The next one is, do we actually have strategy and approach? Next one is our structure, how we're organized, it comes out of the 60s. It's bureaucratic. It's maybe functional. It's not a process-driven one. The next one is, hey, nobody really wants to work there. The people are not engaged and there's a high turnover rate. And the last one, there's so many competing projects. There's no clear or compelling agenda here. So if you would, for those that's with us, maybe walk through and see if you can answer those. These barriers in your community. We'll give it just a couple more minutes here. Well, pretty much, if you look at the folks that responded, it's predominantly these advantages. Either we don't know them or we're not leveraging. So that's interesting to see. Okay, thanks, Rebecca. I'm going to go ahead and remove that. And then we can talk about these advantages a little bit more as we go through the day. Okay. Okay, I'm going ahead and close this out. So let's go ahead and walk through a couple things and a little bit of more background here. So we talked about, we're a consulting firm and we worked in tribal governments and federal governments and tribal enterprises. And we started out as an organization design firm, thinking about how you design high performance organizations. So we worked in organizations like NASA. We've worked for semiconductors. We've worked for federal contractors and helping them think about problems they may have with the organization. But we've always wanted to keep our hand in Indian country. My background is my dad went to the boarding school in Sequoia called the boarding school in Oklahoma called Sequoia. So I always like to keep my hand in Indian country. And so as a result, we've taught classes around economic development, tribal enterprises, some classes on business incubators, entrepreneurial classes, and we've probably been to 50 to 70 communities across Indian country, Alaska and Hawaii included, teaching these classes with folks. And generally, these workshops are funded by the Office of Native American Affairs. Okay, so a little picture here. There's a couple of places we've been. So the white boxes are places where we had classes that pulled in multiple tribes. One up in the Northwest near Seattle, we had a tribal leader came into one of our classes and he said he invited everyone on all of his boards, all his management teams, gently nudged them to attend the class. And so we had a class of 40 people with mostly boards and management teams. And one of the course board members for one of their casinos was the former governor of the state of Oregon. So we've had a wide variety of classes. Down Southwest, we've had probably, of course, the Navajos and the Hopis joined us and a number of tribes there in the Southwest. Oklahoma, we probably had 15 to 20 tribes there. And we've done this class with USEP on what we call the Eastern Regional, probably, Rebecca, 3 or 4 years ago. And then we did one at USEP when it was down in Mississippi with the Choctaws. So these are some of the places we've been and classes we've taught on just the tribal enterprise class. Okay. I'm going to go through the chat line, see if there's if we have any questions. If you have any questions along the way, let me know. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and flip through a couple slides here. So we've always looked at, I'm going to go to a presentation mode here. So if you look at tribes and you look at tribal enterprises, we look at two kinds of enterprises, what we call Enterprise A and Enterprise B. We always see those contrasts. We have one enterprise that starts up great guns and sometimes it falls off. You know, we start going great, we get funding and it falls off. Then there's sort of the second enterprise that continues to move forward. I don't know if you look back at any of your home communities and you can think about any of these enterprises that were successful and ones that failed. And what we tried to do is understand the characteristics of why those that fail exist. Okay, so we look at and compare two tribal enterprises, the A and the B. The first one, the Enterprise A, they have, here are some characteristics. They're just chasing opportunities. There is no clear and compelling purpose. We'll also see that there's political infighting. So, and that impacts the decision-making, whether we start up an enterprise or how we manage it, or what segments we go into, or what businesses we partner with. So we have political infighting. Third is the strategy is just vague. You know, we're just chasing opportunities. We're not necessarily saying no to things. Fourth is the structure is still out of the 60s. You know, it's the same boxes reporting to someone else, and it's bureaucratic. Checkers checking checkers organization. And then there are organizations where it's just not a great place to work. And so people move in and out, so you don't build capabilities, and the turnover is high. And then what we also see is that, you know, we have different managers come in and different boards come in, and we're chasing competing projects. So there's not a great deal of focus, you know. We're into one federal agency and then into another one. And the last one is the lack of community support and trust, meaning, hey, the community doesn't trust the organization. It's not giving back. It's not building the kinds of things that the members need. So that would be the characteristics of what we call Enterprise A. Enterprise B is one where they're very results oriented. They measure the results. Maybe it's a revenue, maybe it's an income, but they're very results oriented. And then the second characteristic is there's capable business leadership, meaning that we've selected folks that have the experience to guide the organization. It's not some friend of a friend. And we'll see that with a lot of startups, that we may not pick the best kind of leadership that steps forward. Third is the decision-making. We're not organized in a manner where we have really good decision-making. We've seen in certain organizations where there'd be a great opportunity out there. In order to get the opportunity funded, they needed to go to council. The council was reluctant on making the decision. It was debated over months, and the opportunity went to another entity. And that other entity was now making in the millions of dollars of revenue. The fourth is there's no approach for dealing in the future. There's no clear approach or strategy. It could be, for instance, we visited with a tribe in Oklahoma, who in the past would just say, I'm in federal contracting and I'm going to chase every opportunity that comes my way. And then they're doing quite well. You know, they're probably making 6 to 8% margins. But at a point in time, they decided that that wasn't sustainable. So they started saying, here are the industry segments or the segments we're going to focus on. And so they started focusing on artificial intelligence. They started focusing on IT so they could build some deep knowledge pools in those areas so they can compete other than using the 8A advantage. They can compete based on their knowledge. So they're positioning themselves for the future. The next element is that you're organized in a business unit way that keeps us focused on the strategy. So if we're organized on federal contracting, then we maybe have a business unit focusing that way, but we're organized in the buckets that help us stay focused. And then it's an organization where everybody wants to come to work, where they're highly engaged, and there's a strong team effort. It's a place where people are knocking on the door and saying, I would like to hire my employee, your employee. And that employee says things like, hey, I'm perfectly happy. I want to stay here. It's where headhunters are knocking at the door to go after good people. And the good people are saying, nope, I don't want to leave. This is a great place. I'm getting paid well. I like the people I work with. We serve a purpose in the community, and these become high performance organizations. The last two deal with sort of actions. The first one is we do what we say we're going to do. It's an action-oriented kind of things. And I don't know if anybody remember a lady called Wilma Mankiller, but Wilma would say one principle of a business or one principle of Native people is they have a value that says, we're going to do what we say we're going to do, we're going to do. So if we make a promise, we're going to follow up. And that last element, tribal enterprises B, the ones that perform better, are the ones that have buy-in from the community. They've got trust in the business, so they let the business run. And then there are others, as we said, where the community doesn't trust that business because it may be politically controlled here. So those are sort of the tale of two enterprises, the enterprise A and B. And so the question I would ask of each of you, have you seen any of the enterprises A in your career or history? And how many's been in enterprise A and how many's been in enterprise B here? Okay, so Chuck, where are you? Somewhere between A and B or leaning towards a B here? I'm going to ask you the question because you're going to talk to us a little bit later on about my sense as a B organization.
We're more of a B organization. Our group really loves each other, loves working together. We all understand our goals, and that's where we're B. Now, I've worked in a lot of A's, and it's not any fun, to say the least. It was kind of a means to an end, but so thankful I'm a part of a B organization now. And I'm in Oklahoma. You're talking a lot about Oklahoma, and I'm part of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. So I see a lot of the B organizations within our tribal community as well.
So up in Choctaw, where are you based? In Durant?
I'm actually in Idabel.
Idabel. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So in Oklahoma, we'll see a lot of. We've seen a lot of A kind of businesses, yeah, and a handful of the tribal enterprises in Oklahoma. Do you think they lean more towards the A or the B?
I think a lot of them, as a whole, chase things. I think they chase the money, they chase the grant, they chase this, and then a lot of that fizzes out. You're starting to see some transition more into the B, into the long-term sustainability and the growth, from what I'm starting to see the more active I get with additional tribes. And that's a lot of your agricultural businesses, your a lot of your approaches to more the federal government side as well, like you were saying. Seeing a lot of that aspect of it, but they're looking, they're spider webbing out instead of just honing in on, just chase the funding. They're chasing more of the buy-in from the community, looking at the different programs. A lot of the healthcare, I'm seeing a lot of growth in the healthcare industry as well within tribal communities. That's even outside of IHS. And so again, the long-term sustainability, things that bring meaning to your community, things that bring meaning to the tribe itself, that also produce the funds necessary to either spin off and do other projects or become self-sustaining.
Right. Yeah. So we see a lot of organizations like the A here. So let me walk through what we've done. Is we've tried to identify 6 factors to think about as you start forming your enterprises or to assess where you stand. So let me walk through a couple of those factors here. So what we'll also see this is a lot of organizations will say, well, we're great. We're doing great guns. And so we would come back and just use a Will Rogers quote that say, even if you're on the right track, you'll get run over if you just sit there. Because the world is changing. It's getting very competitive. And what advantages you had yesterday could be going away. And so what you have to do is start thinking about how I prepare myself for the future. And so we like this quote is, even if you have a management team that seems pretty competent, we would say that you want to keep on learning, keep on pushing the envelope here. So there's a nice Will Rogers quote. So let me walk through a couple of slides here. So a couple things to think about for those that talked about startups. And as you can see, we sort of built this little triangle here. And we have adapted it from some work that Cornell and Galt did about nation building. But what we think about is when we think about tribal enterprises, we think about sort of like 3 broad phases. The first is sort of this foundational piece. It's the people and culture, and it's the governance. The second phase we see is sort of the startup. You got to find the idea, you got to come up with the strategy, you got to test it, you got to have the concept in good place. And so we see that around what I call strategy and alignment. And alignment is just the schematics of the new organization. And then to make it sustainable, it's around, do you have the capabilities in action? I once talked to a tribal leader and they were doing $1 billion in revenue. And he said, we have a lot more ideas than we have resources. We have a lot more ideas than we have people to carry it out. So that's kinds of constraint around capability here. Now, what we'll also see is how this is different than, say, non-native communities. If when we go into a non-native organization, and we've done work for Raytheon and NASA and Hallmark and semiconductors, we always begin with the strategy piece. So generally, culture and governance is not an issue for these folks. In Native communities, culture and governance, that foundational base is the critical success factor, we think. So for Native communities and Native tribal enterprises, this foundational base we think is so critical for success. The culture, to what extent do we get buy-in from the people and the people trust our tribal enterprise? And governance is how decisions are being made. So think about those 3 phases as we go through here, okay? And I like charts, but to think about this, there's the foundational phase. For those that said we're on a startup mode, these are sort of the steps that you would go through. Now, to me, it sounds like, Chuck, you're somewhere around this growth piece, right, that I'm circling here, right? So you're sort of a growing, sustainable business. But for those that are starting out, you want to be thinking about first coming up with this idea, where you're going to focus, the foundational element. Then you're going to think about how I start up and I build my business model and I confirm it. And then I reach this break even and I start to grow. So that's sort of the life cycle. Now for startups, and I know we had some questions about, say I wanted to go into federal contracting. Well, part of the federal contracting work you would do is try to understand, where in the federal contracting world would I go into? Where do I have existing capabilities that I can leverage? Do I have people that I know that have strong IT skills, or they've worked in federal government and where we can leverage those folks? Or do I have some partners or mentors in place that can help me win my first contract? So you want to try to have all that worked up before you even start up. Then you may go get an 8A, but you're going to start spending money, and you go into this ditch here because you're spending money, you haven't broken even, you don't have your first contract, and you want to try to be moving through the cycle here. The key idea is we want to take this break-even point right here and try to move it to the left, move it in. And then we want to have this business model, this concept, this dip, this valley of death, we would call it, and make it shallower. So when you think about starting up, you want to be thinking about how I can move my break-even forward, keep my valley of death low, so I have low investment, low risk capital as I start up here. Okay. So let's look at the factors that make a difference. So we've talked about these a little bit. And then the first one is we always, what I call is begin with the end in mind. And this one is all about, to what extent are we building for our community, and how well does that fit into the vision here? So that's sort of like the first one. Do we have that in mind when we start these businesses? And we'll go through each one of these in a little bit more detail. Second one is, do we actually have good governance? Are we organized properly? Is it LLC? Is it a holding company? Is it who makes what decisions and whom? Does the council make these decisions, and the board makes these decisions, and the general managers make these decisions? How clear are we on that? We've been in a lot of communities where there's not a lot of clarity on the structure, how we're organized, and who makes what decisions when and where. And we'll talk a little bit more. So that's the second factor. Third one is, do we actually have an advantage? There's a guy named Jeff Bezos, and everybody's heard of Bezos, right? So Bezos would say, why would I start a business unless I had an advantage? So we want to look back at our home communities, and we want to look and say, what advantage do I have? If not, I'm competing against other people that may have advantages. So is it deep pockets? Is it some knowledge pools? Is it locational advantage? Is it how we do things? Is it our knowledge? Are we writing, like, for instance, if you go out up in you look at some of the casinos in the Midwest, they're located in towns where they have a market. So the question we would ask for every new startup and for every new business and for existing business is, do I have an advantage to start with? Or, Chuck, the question, have we built an advantage? And we built an advantage. So you can leverage an advantage, but how do we build that advantage as we move forward? Sustainable advantages. Okay, so that's the third factor. The fourth is, how are we different or the same than other tribal enterprises? Are we just copying another tribal enterprise doing the same kind of federal kind of contracting? Or are we picking a niche? We're picking a different customer. We're doing different kinds of work. How are we diversified? But how are we different than someone else? Because every day, even if you're a federal contractor or another business, people have a choice. Do they choose Chuck or do they choose Sarah? And so what we want to do is, how are we going to be different? Is it price? Is it quality? Is it speed? But how do we compete here? The fifth one is this concept of how well are we designed? And we would argue this argument that organizations are perfectly designed to get the results that they get. So if you have bad designs, you're going to get some bad results. If we reward people based on who they know, we're going to get a kind of employees in the group that may not have the talent that we need. If we have processes that are poorly defined, then we may get a different kind of result. So keep in mind, the choices we make in the design leads to the kind of results later on. The sixth and last one is this learning loop. To what extent are we, if you want to think about it, making mistakes and learning quickly? Because we're all going to make mistakes. But there's a discipline involved here. And this is one, is to act and learn, act and learn, act and learn, and move quickly. And not to be frozen because we failed, because if you look across Indian country, there are a lot of tribal enterprises that fail. And sometimes what happens, that stigma sticks with that leadership team. And so then tribal councils become reluctant to invest in tribal enterprises because there's been a series of failures before. Maybe the concept wasn't good. Maybe the funding was poor. Maybe we had the wrong management team in place. But the point of this sixth is, do you have to actually have the leadership that's willing to learn, both at the team level, the management level, the board level, and the council level. So those are the 6 factors. Let me walk through each one of them. And if we have any questions as we go through, raise your hand or put it out in the chat box here. Okay. So the first one, again, is the base. And what's really important about this base, we think it becomes a strategic advantage. So what happens is you have this shared mindset. So if you think about this, in the last 2 years, how much money have flowed into tribal governments? Big bucks. We've heard at least 2 tribes and tribal entities that have received over $1 billion in either CARES work, CARES money, or other kinds of money. I mean, that's $1 billion. Some are 40 million, some are 50 million, some are 100 million. The question is, to what extent was there a mindset on how that should get spent? Or did it get frozen? Or did we do what we've always done, is just pile it into an existing program and add more? Or was it frozen? So one of the things we want to think about is that a high performance organization is one where there's a shared mindset. A shared mindset from the employee level all the way up, from the community all the way up through the organization. So things like a shared vision. Okay, here's what we're trying to do. The point of these things is it accelerates decision making. And then if you have a good understanding of the needs of the community will buy in quicker and you can make decisions quicker. So building and thinking about that community, we think is so important in a Native community. And again, if you look to the left, the key point, it gives legitimacy to that tribal enterprise organization. Okay, so that's the first one. We call it begin with the end in mind. So if you have a clear vision, a clear mission, a clear purpose, it helps you guide all of the remaining decisions. So let's look at the next one. And here's one, just following on that clear, compelling vision. The Cherokees had a vision once of creating a healthy and happy community. So then you would say, To what extent are the decisions we're making in the tribal enterprise driving this happy and healthy community? So all tribal enterprises and organizations need to have this clear and compelling vision here. And that vision is the shared picture of the future. And it's practical. And it's routed in the community. Okay. The second one is, to what extent are you translating what the community says back into the enterprise? So things that are important here is how does the governance, how does the council translate what they're learning from the community into the tribal enterprise? It's questions like, what's the purpose of the tribal enterprise? We've been in locations where, in board meetings, and I'll share a story, we're in a village up in Alaska, and they were just starting out their tribal enterprise. And we started asking the question, what's the purpose of the enterprise? Is it to make money? Is it to make income? Is it to make revenue? Is it to deliver social services? Is it to create jobs? Is it to protect the land? Is it to build houses? Is it to build homes? And in that group, there was no clear end outcome. So someone brought to the table and said, hey, our community, we need some transportation because we're limited up here in the village. We don't have individual cars. So let's just buy a bus. We'll make a business out of buying a bus. They bought a bus, spent the $40,000 to $60,000 on bus to transport employees to a location or transport people in the community. Then after 3 or 4 years, they found that bus out in the field. It lost its interest, it lost its purpose. So in our discussion, we started asking the question is, what's your purpose? And it took a bit of conversation. They started saying things like, well, we're a startup, we need to think about revenue. And someone would argue, well, it's more than revenue, we need income so we can reinvest. So over the course of the discussion, the board sort of narrowed down and said something as simple as this: we're all about in our startup to produce income so that we could reinvest. Now that same tribal enterprise today just topped $12 million in revenue in federal contracting. And they've stayed to the core purpose of producing income. They haven't wandered away and started reinvesting in housing or transportation or diversifying too quickly, but they've stayed clear about here's the income. And so now they've topped $12 million in revenue. They're producing $500 to $1 million in income. They're holding that to reinvest back into the community. The other key point of this is then thinking about how you're structured. Is it a holding company? Is it LLC? How do you protect in terms of risk? How do you form the structure? And then trying to understand the clear roles and what policies and procedures you have in place. So we think about this small village corp that went from 0 to 12 million. They started thinking about, they were clear on their purpose. They formed a holding company, which is an LLC from their parent, and then reinvested in creating 2 subsidiaries that would focus on 2 different entities in the federal government. And then they started thinking about, here are the decisions the general managers make, and here are the decisions that we as council would make. So that's the second one. And that's, again, thinking about how we organize. Are we a holding company, an LLC? How do we organize the subsidiaries to gain an advantage? And then what we also want to be clear on that element here is clarifying the roles. So in this little chart, what it does indicate, and what we see a lot of times is we're asking our tribal enterprise, which is on the business development side, it's like saying, Chuck, I want you to do economic development. So I want you to build a park. I want you to build some housing or healthcare. And then they may also say, Chuck, well, I also need you to do these other kinds of things in terms of nation building. So what happens for Chuck, if we ask Chuck to do all things, he can't focus. So we think there are like at least 3 successful kinds of roles in here in the business and tribal enterprise. Is first, the tribal council owns building this strong base, good governance, good policies, good connection to the community. And then we think there's a second role in here. And this could be within the tribe, is thinking about who's going to be thinking about the economic development. And economic development is different than business development or tribal enterprise development. You know, economic development sort of has an outcome that's spread among a number of different people. The business development is really a focused enterprise. It's got a clear purpose and mission. So the key thing is we want to think about clarifying the roles. And what we found in poor performing organizations, they mix this up. They're asking the tribal enterprise to do economic development, or they may fund economic development people or put those in the tribal enterprise. And what happens, it loses a lot of focus. And then they're subject to a lot of political problems here. So clarifying these kinds of roles we think is really important. Okay. The next one is trying to understand where the advantages exist. Scanning the horizon. And you want to build on those advantages. And what we think is those advantages then give you a competitiveness and enhances your competitiveness. So let's look, we'd go through what we call a standard SWOT, and most of you have seen this. But what we want to do is think about where are the strengths and weaknesses within the organization. And that's internal. And where are the threats and opportunities? Now, generally for a tribal enterprise, they're thinking about these strengths and weaknesses. This is the stuff that Chuck battles every single day. And then his board would spend a lot of time thinking about these opportunities and threats. Not to say that Chuck doesn't, but Chuck is working on building on the strengths and mitigating the weaknesses. But the boards need to be thinking about these opportunities and threats. And from this, these opportunities, you can start identifying where there's potential areas for advantages here. Like we know that with the Biden administration and previous administrations, there's going to be a strong growth in infrastructure. How are we positioned there? To what extent are we positioned in healthcare? To what extent? So these are sort of trends we can start looking for opportunities out there. Okay, part of it is also understanding as you mine through your community, where are their current capabilities? Sorry, I'm gonna turn that. Turn that on. But to think about our capabilities in our community, we want to sort of scan through these sort of elements here. We can say, to what extent are these where we have a strength in? Is it our natural resources? Land, natural resources. Up north in one of the villages, they said land, they have extensive land holdings. So there's some extensive green tax credits associated with that. So they'll be able to pull some money off that. The third one is looking at people. To what extent in your workforce can some of these folks be leveraged? Service personnel, IT personnel, how do we connect those? Governance, to what extent is our strength in our tribal enterprises? What access to infrastructure? Do we have good roads, housing, rail, air? Our institutions, how can we leverage the knowledge that's within those? We've seen a tribe that said, hey, we've developed a strong IT and security background in our casinos. We're going to leverage that to then grow into the federal contracting world. To what extent are we located? We've got access to good markets. Are we right near Minneapolis? Are we close to propensity to large size? And to what extent do we have capital? So what you can do is think about, as we not mine our community, is think about these strengths here. Okay, so those are thinking about where's our strengths and where's our relative strength that we want to leverage. So this is the tool set you could use. The fourth item is thinking about how we choose to compete. So we take all those advantages and we take those assessments and we start asking ourselves, which arenas are we going to move into? Which activities? So we have to come up with what I call a strategy on how to compete here. So strategy becomes this concept. There's generally, for Chuck, there's generally more opportunity than resources. So we've got to think about the resources we're going to focus on. Because if they're limited resources, we can't go chase everything. So we got to be focused. So then you have to get to a point where you start weighing trade-offs. And we can say, if you're not saying no to opportunities that come your way, then it tells me you don't have a strategy. So what we want to come up with a strategy. And that helps guide you to start thinking about what industries you're in and you're not in. Where do we move? Where do we transport? And you can scan through these industries and you can say, which of these are growing very strong? Like we know, alternative energy, gaming's growing, agriculture is growing, federal contracting, natural resources. So we have to ask ourselves, what industries are we in and not in, or want to be in? So this is part of trying to understand your strategy, okay? And the last point on strategy is this, I like this Sun Tzu quote, strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. So you got to have both of these elements, the strategy, the broad, grand direction. And then how do we go to battle on the tactics? Okay, so let's look at the fifth one and we'll look at the sixth one and then we'll sort of give us some time for some questions here. So part of this fifth one is how do we choose to organize? You can think about if you're building a house, it's what's the architecture, the schematics for it. And what we want to understand in our organization is what is the work that we want to be unique in. What is the work that we want to just be averaging? We asked this question of NASA once. We asked the question is, NASA, tell us, what's your unique work? What makes you different than all other organizations? And NASA said, yeah, there's a bit of silence there. Because NASA wasn't clear. Is it program management? Is it procurement? Is it launching of rockets? Is it retrieving rockets? Is it the science? We would argue 10 years ago, they weren't clear. But what they've chosen now is to be clear is they've outsourced the launching of rockets to a couple guys like Elon Musk and his company, Virgin Air, and Bezos. So they outsourced some of their work so they could focus on what they're really good at and they could leverage. Now, as a result of what NASA did by having a good design on organizations of what they chose to do, what used to cost $60 million for a rocket launch maybe costs $30 million today. But can you imagine the technology that's gone into these recent launches that's different than the past? Today, one of the fuel canisters lands on a ship, and in the past, it would fall into the ocean and get retrieved and maybe not reused. So part of that is understanding this concept, is that all organizations are perfectly designed to get the results that they get. So if you're poorly designed, you're going to get different kinds of results. And you can see this sort of amusing photograph here, is that, that people will bypass some of the designs and you'll get these unintended results. And as you think about this work, this is an example of how we start to clarify work between, let's say, an operating company, a holding company, and a board. In the past, it would be just one bucket of stuff. Now, if we start to organize differently, we know that the board sets objectives, provides oversight, holds people accountable, And then their holding company identifies other 8As and grows them from the beginning to end. And then the operating company goes out and wins contracts. They did this so they could be clear about what we're going to hold each of the entities accountable for. And this is part of understanding the schematic. And you could call this a schematic of a tribal enterprise or any enterprise. And this is actually one of a tribal enterprise that started to think about and clarify what work's done at different levels. Okay, let me look at the last one here. And this last one is the ability to act. And you may say, well, that's not important. But what I think is really important is thinking about is for me as a consultant, I learned a long time ago, if I don't complete a job, I don't get paid. And if I don't get paid, I don't eat. And if I don't eat or don't get paid, I can't buy shoes for my kids. So what I have to do is go to some actions and make sure I have the vital few actions. Who owns those actions? Who's responsible for those? How are we tracking those? And you may say, well, yeah, we know this. But the better performing organizations have a discipline built around this. And it's things like understanding what I do in today's horizon, today, what we do in the near term, and what we're thinking about in the future, and we're not mixing the three. So an example of this would be very clear. You know, they want to hire, you know, in the first 6 months, you say, here are the things we want to do. In the 6 to 18 months, here are the things we want to do. In 18 months to 5 years, here are the things you want to do. So you start thinking about these different horizons. You think about horizon 3 as the end in mind, then you back into horizon 2 and horizon 1. And you'll see horizon 1 is really around business planning. You know, it's business planning in the year. Horizon 2 could be strategic plans. And then horizon 3 could be a future. So these are the 6, what I call 6 factors. Let me just go back to them real quick. I'm thumbing through those 6 factors here. So we think those 6 factors help guide us in starting up our organization here. Okay, so those are sort of the questions the factors, that success factors I wanted to share to help create the difference between enterprise A, and B. So what I'd like to do now is, if you have any questions for me, here's my contact. Also, just to offer up, is we do these tribal enterprises. We're funded by the SBA, so there's no cost to you. So for a tribal enterprise in North Dakota, they hosted a workshop. We went to them at no expense to them. They flew in all their VPs, and we walked through the concept of these factors, develop business models, develop strategies, and push the envelope on their current thinking. So if you have an interest in hosting a workshop for your tribal organization or a tribal entity, you can reach out to me. We also have a second set of workshops we offer for entrepreneurs, sort of the mom and pop entrepreneurs. And these are generally 2-day workshops. Again, there's no cost for the tribal enterprise class. There's no cost for the entrepreneurship class. We do this because we're funded by the Office of Native American Affairs. The only constraint we have is that we only do 15 of these. And we just finished up one with enterprises up in Minnesota and Wisconsin. We've got one, we just finished one with the Hopi. We're going back to Minnesota, and we're starting to schedule those out. We've got folks in the Northwest, 2 tribes in the Northwest. Chuck, we got 2 in Oklahoma that have an interest. We have 2 in the Arizona area. So if you have any interest, email me or call me and I can give you some more detail. So Rebecca, I got to check and see if you're still there, Rebecca.
We're here.
I'm going to turn this over to you and just say, hey, thanks for letting me be here. And if you have any questions, give me a call. So I'm going to, if you want to take over the screen, Rebecca, it's on to you.
Awesome, thank you. We included Kyle's contact information in the chat box, but you can also, you'll have a copy of the slide with his contact information to reach out in case you might be interested. Thank you, Kyle, for that introduction, and especially I think it's so great with how it's presented between at the start of the conversation, the differences between Tribal Enterprise A and Tribal Enterprise B, because I think a lot of us have, you know, there's some businesses that automatically come to mind when we think about it in that context. So that's wonderful. So we had a chance, and we'll move on to our second and our final presenter this morning, and that is Mr. Cody Williamson, who is the president and CEO of Creek Indian Enterprises Development Authority, which is the tribal economic development authority for the Porch Band of Creek Indians. The Porch Band of Creek Indians received federal recognition in 1984. The same year, they became a member of USED. And as president and CEO, Mr. Williamson knows the day in and day out challenges that tribal enterprise face, but also the unique solution they have in creating vibrant and thriving tribal economies. So with that, Cody, I gave you co-hosting authority. There should be a button at the bottom of the screen where you'll be able to share your PowerPoint and give us a wonderful introduction on the history of Creek Indian Enterprises and the history, a little bit of the history at Porch Creek.
Good morning, everybody. I'm trying to find this button here, but if I don't find it, oh, there we go. Let's see if this will work. Okay. For some reason, it's not letting me share the screen. So let's just do this.
I can pull it up, and if you want to just have me guide me through it, we can do it that way.
We can do that. I'm really informal. So in looking at what you guys had before, in terms of some of the stuff that was that my screen or your screen?
That's my screen.
Okay. So, Rebecca, if you don't go to slide 2, please. There we go. So the way the Porch Creek have their development team is they have actually 2 different development sides. They've got us, which is Creek Indian Enterprises. We do everything that is non-gaming. And then they have PCI Gaming Authority, which is gaming. That does change with certain tribes. Certain tribes have everything under the development authority. We don't, and that actually works out pretty good. We kind of know what lane we're in, and then the gaming side knows what they're in. Now, what I will tell you is, first and foremost, this is something that you should do regardless of what what entity or enterprise you're going to try to get into. You have to manage expectations, particularly managing expectations against gaming, because we were in gaming first and then had some development going on. And then we decided to get into a bigger project, which I will show you in a minute. And of course, all the feasibility studies and everything said, hey, this is going to be a great project. It's going to be gaming-esque, and it's not. I will tell you, no matter what project you're getting into, unless Elon Musk is a partner, there is nothing out there that is gaming related that will get you the return on investment that you will see on gaming. If you build it, most of the time they will come, but that's the only time you build it and they will come. So just heads up on that because we've had to deal with that a lot. Next slide, Rebecca, please.
Is this the one, the listing of all, can you see the listing of all the enterprises?
I don't see it yet.
Oh. Let me try, let me try this again.
Technology.
Okay, that's the one you can see.
Yes. Okay.
Perfect.
So those are all of we've entered into a lot of different enterprises and businesses. We've got some convenience stores, which were put in initially with what you would call the smoke shop. Those smoke shops are not smoke shops anymore, although they do sell cigarettes. Their main business is actually just a regular convenience store. We also have some private equity stuff. We got some real estate partnerships with hotels. We own some hotels. We have some 8A businesses, which is that corner box there with the Itchkey Holdings. And then, of course, we have the big Foley development, which is OWA. All right, next slide. So you can go past this one. So OWA was something that we got into. And again, you have to be careful kind of what happens. A lot of times the council gets pulled in a number of different directions. Everybody has the best idea ever. Every time they present it to either the board or the council, it's the best thing since sliced bread, and you're going to make a killing at it. So you got to do it. And a lot of times they will, you get into something that looked really good and then it's not as good as it seems. OWA happens to be one of those. So for us, when we originally got into OWA, we were just the land purchaser. And so we were part of a bigger group. Well, that bigger group, which was the Blue Collar Comedy Tour, which was, I think, Jeff Foxworthy, Bill Engvall, those guys. The developer, I'm not exactly sure because I wasn't involved, but I think he went bankrupt. And the city of Foley, they were kind of in the middle of everything. So the city of Foley comes to us and says, hey, can you salvage this project? So back in 2013, that's when we started to think about salvaging this project. And in 2015, we did. Now, the problem was when you look at a feasibility study said this is going to be the greatest project ever. You're going to get 750,000 people there out of the 10 million that come to visit the local area of Gulf Shores, Orange Beach. So this is a no-brainer. Well, we opened up in 2017. And as you can see, we've continued to have to make improvements to the project because it just didn't come out like the feasibility study said. So again, another cautionary tale. Don't necessarily believe everything that a feasibility study tells you, because it will, a lot of times if it says it's really bad, it probably is bad. If it says it's good, it's probably good. If it says it's going to, rain sunshine, maybe. Temper it a little bit because you never know what you're going to get. All right. So as we go through, that's what our current map is for OWA, and just to let you know kind of how big of a scale that is. But again, this project is a little bit of everything that you're going to deal with when you get into enterprises. It looks good to start with. It then becomes really hard. You have to fight for nickels and dimes to try to make it to try to make it work. A lot of times too, you get into something like this, which is a bigger project, and you have gaming projects going on at the same time. You're kind of fighting for the same dollar. And the problem that you will have, and our council has been very good at this, but there is a problem. If you have only a limited amount of money available and you've got a gaming project that's probably going to return 20, 30, 40% or more versus your project, which is a long-term project that's probably not going to return 10, 12% in a extended period, the money's probably going to go to gaming first. But you have to fight out or be prepared to fight for those dollars, because one of the things that will happen, and we're fixing it at OWA, is you know, sometimes you don't get as much money and you start to cut stuff. And once you cut stuff, it's a bad problem to have, because, you know, in our stuff, we cut some theming that we really, really needed to make this an amusement park. So we're having to go back and fix that kind of stuff. And so next slide. When this originally came out, I put this slide in there simply because when this originally came out, the park was called The Park. That was what it was called. So think about that. You know, when we thought, oh, this feasibility study says no matter what we do, they're going to come. So it got named The Park, and that wasn't very good. So now we're having to go back and retheme and do all this other kind of stuff. The next slide shows you our mascot. You know, we didn't have a mascot, so we're having to do that kind of stuff. So it's just those things that you have to think through about how this is going to work. And this is any business. It just happens to be one of our bigger ones. And of course, going through the next couple of slides is just our latest thing that we're having to do to put this thing, which is an indoor water park, a wave pool, and some other stuff that we're doing to kind of work through this project. But you have to have the backing of it, of your council and your board. And you also have to, again, when you manage those expectations, you have to let the council be aware that this is a long-term play, not short-term, because a lot of times, particularly if you have gaming, return on gaming is almost immediate. I mean, you could put 50 machines in a metal building and you're probably going to get $100 a day per machine. So you're not going to get that with some of these long-term plays that you have with these enterprises and businesses. Next slide. So this is just a couple things that as I was thinking through this, you know, things that we've had to deal with, you know, the managed expectations, you know, the gaming returns, and it's not gaming. Certainly do not overpromise, because a lot of times you're going to want to overpromise and it's going to look like you want to overpromise. But if you do, they're going to expect that. And again, it's very difficult to do, particularly with businesses. Be willing to say no to projects, because again, there's going to be a lot of projects that are brought before you, and you need to play to whatever your strengths are in terms of what bench strength you have, or what you're willing to pay to go get bench strength. And this one is probably one of the biggest ones. If you're coming from a governmental enterprise, a development authority is not government. It's a business. So when everybody wants to be off because they're doing this or doing that, and you have to work. And gaming knows that. Gaming does that a lot because they tend to be open 24/7, 365. But a lot of times the development side, particularly if you started off in government, you kind of run it as government, but you have to get rid of that mentality in order to push things forward. So really quickly, let's say I got a couple minutes. So I know you guys talked about some 8As. So we did get into the 8A world. We started back in 2016 to establish some of our 8As. Right now we have 8As, and then we have some sister companies that are with those. So a lot of times, you know, people want to talk about starting 8As and how simple it is. The issue with an 8A is that you have to have past performance. So if you start up something, you don't have past performance, your chances of winning a contract are slim. So what you need to do is a couple ways. Probably first and foremost, if you have the money, you go buy somebody who's coming out of 8A that's graduating. They already have the contract. They already know the purchasing folks. They can get that contract again. They just need the vehicle. So you either team up with them or you purchase them. Otherwise, you might want to go get, hire a retiring general. That is true. We've hired a retiring general before. You want to hire retiring contracts officers, stuff like that, because they can get you in the door when others can't. But I can tell you that just starting an 8A does not mean you're going to get business. You need to get to the contracting officer in order to get them to give you the contract. And a lot of times what you need to do is we call it, we're stealing from Staples, but we call it the easy button. You want to give a package to that contracting officer that he cannot refuse, that he basically says, I want to give this to you. I need to give this to you. You have given me all the tools so that I don't have to fight this out. I don't have to worry about protest or anything like that. So yes, this is in my best interest to give you this contract. So look at that, 15 minutes on the dot. So that is a quick and dirty of some of the stuff we do. So I know if there are any questions, I don't know I think you have a question and comment section, Rebecca, is that right?
Yeah, feel free for both. Thank you so much, Cody, for giving that fantastic introduction and insight into a real life example of tribal enterprise activities going on.